do you think actually there is a single gay person on the planet who doesn't have that voice? And I said, there isn't. And she's like, well, we've all been raised in an environment where this is wrong. So of course we have that voice. She's like, so again, I'm okay with that voice existing, but you need to make a choice. Because if you let that voice run our relationship, we don't stand a chance. But if you can hold that voice with respect and compassion, but not let her interfere all the time with us, then we might stand a chance.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Code 3 Life Reinvented. I am your friendly host, at least I hope so, AJ, and I am really looking forward to today's conversation with my guest. We are going to dive into, I think, some really interesting things around consciousness, acceptance, including self-acceptance, and tying that into an element of our own personal reinventions and making changes in our own lives. Today's guest is named Nadja Taranczewski, who lives in Berlin. I've gotten to know her. We are both members of another community, and we've crossed paths, and I find her to be a woman with tremendous wisdom and knowledge, and I am super excited to introduce her to all of you and to jump into this conversation. So Nadja, thank you so much for being a guest on Code 3.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's a real treat. It's a real treat. And I've just enjoyed our interactions that we've had over the last year. I'd love to ask you, as I do so many of our guests, have you had some sort of Code 3 moment in your life?
Yeah, so we spoke about this earlier, right? And I needed to confirm that it's not just connected to a medical emergency, because luckily that hasn't happened yet. But in terms of my own biography, there was probably one pivotal moment that changed the trajectory actually of my life. And it happened when I was 29, so 5 years ago. No, that's a joke, of course, because I'm 53 now, so it's been a while. But with 29, I've had sort of in terms of my relationship life, so I was sort of a serial monogamist, if you want, right? So I've had different relationships with different men over the course of my late teens until my late tweens. And then when I turned 29, shortly there before, I fell in love with a woman. And her name is Olga. And I will take the ending already ahead of the whole story, because tomorrow is actually our 24th anniversary. So we've made it. We're still going strong. And it's been
Congratulations.
Incredible. Thank you so much. It's been an incredible relationship and the most formative relationship probably of my adult years. Now, the reason why it was pivotal was because before I fell in love with Olga, I had never been with a woman. And that created a very interesting dynamic in me that came completely unexpected. Because frankly, I grew up with very liberal parents, fairly liberal country, Germany. So I didn't actually think much of people who were homosexual. I don't even know if I consciously knew that many, probably 5 or something. It just wasn't anything that I was concerned with. And falling in love with Olga, for obvious reasons, changed that. And the most shocking thing that happened to me at the time was not actually me falling in love, but it was the whole dynamic internally to me that got kicked off by this choice from my heart that I found deeply disturbing, and that frankly took me years of coaching and therapy and conversations with Olga to work through, because I discovered that I actually had quite a homophobic side. And that was nothing that I knew about myself. And frankly, it was also nothing that I wanted to know about myself, because that did not confirm to my self-image. I was this easygoing, liberal person that had no worry about anyone's lifestyle. And suddenly all of these judgments about me came up in myself, more actually than in my real environment. My environment was, I would say, very surprised, but I didn't get a lot of pushback. And certainly nobody deserted me because of this situation.
When you think about that change in your own view of yourself, I've got to believe there's a worldview shift as well. What was that like?
It was extremely disorientating because I did not know what box I would fit in anymore, right? So as I was still waiting for my prince on the white horse, patiently to be swept away and swept off my feet, here came Olga, right? And I was always attracted to sort of tall men, and she's 2 centimeters shorter than I am, right? So nothing about this dynamic really fit with my inner picture of what this should be like, my life, my love interest. And I did not understand how to identify anymore because they weren't, firstly, I could not really think of myself as a lesbian. Like that created just wanted my toenails to curl because all the images that I had of lesbians were certainly not how I saw myself. I had no role models. I did not know, who am I in this mix? I'm not going to wear a plaid shirt anytime soon and start chopping wood. And that was the only stereotype that I had about women who loved other women. This discovery of this room in me, or these rooms in me, or you could also say the different selves in me that were utterly unaccepting of this development, was again a very, very startling discovery. One of the pivotal moments, I would say, in this relationship came probably maybe 4 or 5 years into the relationship. So I always knew there was something between Olga and myself that was incredibly strong. And it continues to be there until today, luckily. But at the same time, I really, really struggled with my identity. And so at some point, we thought maybe we need to get external help because Olga was a bit at the end of her wits. She also couldn't quite figure out why she had fallen for a straight woman, because she said, I learned to not do that when I was 16 because that's where pain lives. So why did I fall in love with you? Like, what is going on here? So we went to a friend of mine who was at the time a voice dialogue facilitator. So she looked at different inner parts or selves. And the idea behind voice dialogue is that instead of thinking of your personality as sort of one fixed thing, this is the person I am, it might be much closer to reality and how you experience yourself and how other people experience you, to think of, well, they're actually quite different versions of Nadja in this case. And it might be helpful to talk to them separately. Because when I sit here and I talk about my experience, all of these voices get mixed in with one another. They are interjecting, they're highlighting certain things, they're censoring one another. And it just ends up being this muddled mess of unclarity. And that's basically how I felt when we made the step to see this facilitator. And so what the facilitator did was, Olga was witnessing. So she put her somewhere on the sofa and then she worked with me. And the way this particular process works, and some of your clients might be familiar with IFS, internal family systems. Mm-hmm. So there's similarity there in terms of the process. I started out at a particular seat. And then when she would ask me, what is the first voice that comes up in respect to the current situation you're in, this relationship, I would literally shift positions in the room. And then the moment my butt hit a new chair, I was not Nadja anymore. I was a part of Nadja. And she started to engage with that part. But honestly, it's this quite surreal experience. I don't know if you've ever done it.
No, I've never done that. So you literally moved from one chair to the next in the room and a different personality of you came through.
And really the assumption is, let this part of you talk uncensored and hold it with all the compassion you're capable of. And at least that's what the facilitator has to do, even if you might not be able to do it, so that the speaking of that perspective's truth creates more calmness and more clarity in a person. And I've seen this work 1,000 times. It really is quite impressive. But what happened when I changed chairs was that immediately this highly judgmental, very, very homophobic part of me came out and she started talking. So the facilitator's job is simply to hold that part in compassion. So they're not judging, they're not debating with that part about the validity of their perspective. They're just a little bit like you're doing with me now. They're just there to get out that person's perspective, right? Nothing else. So they're just interviewing. So she started talking to that part, and that part was saying things like, this is disgusting. Why would she do that? Nadja had other plans for her life. How is she ever going to think she'll have a family? So, a lot of that came out. I'm going to spare you the details. It wasn't pretty. And then at the very end, the facilitator asked that part, so if you have a positive intention for Nadja, what is it? And then the part said, something that, that made it possible for me to kind of accept her. It said, well, Nadja always felt like an outsider. And that has a lot to do with my family story that maybe we'll get into a bit later. Coming from a sort of diverse cultural background and always feeling a bit between the cracks. And so the path said, if Nadja has the choice to be with a man, then why does she not make that choice? Why does she have to take the difficult route? Why does she have to single herself out and make herself vulnerable in that way? I don't want her to be unsafe. So with that being said, the facilitator thanked that part, put me back on my starting chair, and I sat there. And AJ, I'm telling you, I sat there honestly with my hand over my face because I felt so ashamed. I was like, oh my God, all of that came out of my mouth, right?
Right.
And then Olga did something that I will never forget, because she looked at me and she took my hands and she said, listen, firstly, do you think I don't know that that voice is in you? I know that voice. And she said, I'm okay with that voice. Yeah. She said, do you think actually there is a single gay person on the planet who doesn't have that voice? And I said, there isn't. And she's like, well, we've all been raised in an environment where this is wrong. So of course we have that voice. She's like, so again, I'm okay with that voice existing, but you need to make a choice. Because if you let that voice run our relationship, we don't stand a chance. But if you can hold that voice with respect and compassion, but not let her interfere all the time with us, then we might stand a chance. And honestly, I was so blown away, firstly, by what I felt her incredible generosity in the face of the plethora of awful things that this part of me had just said. The insight that apparently every person who is different, and I would probably say that's probably true for every person that is different, regardless of what exactly that difference is, but certainly every gay person does have this inner experience. And then thirdly, she introduced this element of choice that she said, you can listen to that voice, but you don't have to do what that voice says. And that to me was mind-boggling. Yeah, and then maybe just to complete and sort of redeem myself a little bit, because what you do in voice dialogue, and that has become a big theme in my work today as well, is you always look for what's on the other side, right? Sort of coming from the assumption, okay, now we've talked to one voice, but what is the polarity to that? And so she asked, is there anybody else in you who wants to say something about this? And where the first energy I realized was very much modeled after my German grandmother, right? So very proper, very Protestant, very judgmental. Then suddenly somebody in me raised their hand. She's like, I want to say something. So I jumped to a different chair. And what came out was entirely an energy of a 16-year-old. And she was like, I don't know what this person was all about, right? Nadja falling in love with Olga is the best thing since sliced bread. Finally, something exciting is happening here. These have been the best years of my life. Olga is so amazing. We have such a great relationship together. Nothing that I've ever experienced with men was equal to that in terms of the level of dialogue and depth of connection. And I am so excited. I'm so happy. That was, of course, also a longer conversation. But essentially, then I ended with these two polarities or qualities in me. Right. And realizing, oh, I have both of these parts, but I am neither, because there's also a lot more in me than just these two parts. But that was a turning point.
I'm absolutely fascinated by the practice of shifting chairs for different modes of personality to come through and speak from our inside out. And I am fascinated by that. And thank you for being vulnerable and open and sharing. For our audience here, I'd like to introduce you a little more, because you have a company called ConsciousU. You also have a book out entitled ConsciousU, Become the Hero of Your Own Story. And you work both with individuals. You have a master's of psychology. You're a certified coach. So you work with individuals. You work with organizations. You've been spending a fair amount of time in Japan, as I understand things. Was your work in consciousness and your interest in exploring that before this age 29 awakening, so to speak? Did it come later? And how did you land there? And why are you passionate about it?
It definitely came before. And again, so maybe this is the moment where diving a little bit into family story makes sense. As I shared with you, I have this culturally mixed background. I was born and raised in Germany, and I have half of my family is German, my mom's half. And on my dad's side, my grandfather was Russian and my grandmother was Polish. And my father was also born in Germany, but he was actually stateless until he was 18. Then he joined the German army to get a German passport and residency. I grew up with these two very, very different realities. And both of these realities were deeply scarred and influenced by what had unfolded during World War II. Because, of course, no family, not just in Germany, no family in Europe was untouched from these events. And on my German side, I would say I have a very classical German experience in the sense that it just wasn't talked about afterward. Whatever happened during World War II was blanketed in silence, essentially. What I do know is that my grandfather did not actually go to war because he was running the state library in the state of Hesse also throughout the war, which is certainly a privilege that you did not have without being a party member and or whatever else was required for him to maintain that position during the war. The horror that my grandparents, who were very educated people, very Christian, I'm pretty sure they were not feverish supporters of the Nazis and Hitler, but they were like many Germans, like most Germans during that time, sort of trotting along, sort of agreeing, not interfering, not protesting. Because the reality is, by the time many Germans fully understood what was going on, it was in a way too late without really risking your life. So there were some of the people who just kept quiet. And again, it just wasn't talked about. Then my mom's side, she was born and raised in a city called Wiesbaden near Frankfurt in the center of Germany. While at the same time, my dad's family had a very different experience. So my grandfather was Russian. My grandmother was Polish, which, as far as I understand, was not a very pleasant childhood. And she was in Warsaw when the Germans marched in. So her story unfolded that the Germans apparently captured a bunch of Polish people, put them into a work camp, and she was one of them. And then at some point, they selected women in the camp that they deemed good-looking, appealing, whatever, to be live-in prostitutes for German officers. So my grandmother was a live-in prostitute for a German officer, lived in Berlin throughout the war, and it was, as far as the war goes, even though, of course, that is horrible, but it was probably one of the safer places to be. She was taken care of, she had food, and she had a child by this man. Now, in parallel, my Russian grandfather in Paris was approached by the Nazis to become an informant because they felt he had such amazing ties into the Eastern European community that could be of value. And after he declined kindly, they threw him into a concentration camp. And he was actually in a camp twice and was basically tortured into submission. So he did end up being an informant for the Nazis. And then in one of his trips that the Nazis endorsed, he was sent to Berlin. But that's where he met my grandmother. I don't know, maybe it was love at first sight. I don't really know a lot about their history there. But at any rate, they both made a bond and agreed that when the war was over, they would try to meet somewhere in West Germany because it was very clear to them that they would not survive their respective home countries because they had been collaborators and they would have just been executed. So when the war ended, he fled from Paris towards West Germany and she fled from Berlin. She did run into a battalion of Russians, was raped, somehow managed to rescue her child. And then they found each other in a Red Cross camp in Wiesbaden. Sometimes I'm just also amazed at how did people manage, right? I mean,
survive that. I don't.
They survive, and also how did you find each other? Anyway, they did find each other, but they were essentially stuck in the land of the perpetrator, right? My grandfather, for the duration of his life, tried to get reparations from the Germans that he felt he was entitled to, and the way he tried to do that, because his German was very, very bad. He learned it quite late in life, and it never really took to it. So he made my 10-year-old father translate all of these torture stories from the camps so that he could write it down in German and send it to the officials, to be assessed whether he was eligible. My father grew up in extreme poverty in sort of a one-room apartment without running water and often without food, and he grew up stateless. And so for him to join the army was then a way to grow roots, to belong somewhere.
the Polish grandmother had a child by the German officer who is your father.
No, he's actually not my father. She was my oldest aunt. My father was one of the two children she had with my Russian grandfather.
The Russian grandfather.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. You sort of asked, how did I get into consciousness development? Honestly, I think it was just the aftermath of all of that dynamic in my family, right? So I grew up with the silence on my German side of the family, and on the Russian-Polish side, I grew up with violence and alcohol. My Russian grandfather drank himself into the grave. I think he never recovered from the experiences he's had in the camps. My father was very ill-equipped in many ways to be a young father. My parents had me when they were both 23, I believe, but with virtually no skills around understanding their own family system, understanding all the pain that was hidden there, understanding that their parents didn't have any coping mechanisms. So my father experienced a lot of violence in his household, and some of that he continued to pass on in our family then. I suppose the question then that came up in me when I was beginning to enter my teens was really, why am I so unhappy? Why am I constantly sad? Why do I developed a quite severe eating disorder when I was 16 that lasted until I was probably 25. So there was a lot going on for me that I couldn't entirely justify by just my own life. And I'm not saying that I had a super easy childhood, but many people have divorced parents, and my parents divorced when I was 7. It wasn't a walk in the park, but there were certainly worse childhoods. And I think that's when I became interested in the research around intergenerational trauma and realizing that a lot of the weight I was carrying was actually not mine. So that was the starting point, trying to heal myself. And then at some point, I became interested in the question of how do we prevent this? Or the first starting question was, why do people do such things to each other? Like, how can you torture another human being? How is that possible? The only way that it is possible is when you are unconsciously driven by your fears, when you've been subjected to a narrative that completely dehumanizes the person in front of you, and when you have no emotional impulse control, right? When you have no way of understanding what you're feeling at a given moment in time and no other way of self-regulating than violence. So for me, I've always been interested in what is the magic pill that helps us prevent it. And in short, I think it's consciousness.
And so you've committed your life's work professionally in this field. When you work with individuals, what does that work look like?
That is a good question, because I'm one of those coaches. I haven't had a proper website in 20 years. And I keep thinking I should have a website. Everybody has a website. But somehow, always when I work on writing copy for that website, it just all sounds so trite that I think everybody does that, right? So what's special about that? I don't even know what to write. When clients find me, what they think we need to work on is not necessarily what we end up doing. The clients that find me in my personal practice, I work usually with either CEOs or high net worth individuals that also invest a significant amount of money, but also a significant amount of time into working with me for 6 months. What we do is in some ways completely unremarkable, because what I would say in the most simple terms I do is I help them fall in love with themselves. So I help them to figure out what are the parts, the rooms, the selves that they have that they deem unacceptable, right? Where do they drop out of self-compassion? Because I feel if we can't have self-compassion, we cannot possibly have any grounded compassion for anybody else either. So that is a huge part of the process. And then the other part is I help them to dare voicing the things that they haven't allowed to think because of their family, because of how they were raised, of what a successful life was supposed to look like. And so the people that I work with, because they are at the place in life that they are at, have often created this success at great cost, right? So they haven't And you know these people because I think in some ways you were probably one of them at some point, right? So they've driven themselves relentlessly. They have ignored their health. They have, even if they had significant health issues, they just sort of pushed through. Many of the men have iffy relationships with their kids because they have never been around, and their children are like, "You're a stranger to me. Like, what do you want?" They are often in their second or maybe even third marriage. So a lot of things have fallen by the wayside. And so I invite them to start with a blank slate and go, well, what if you actually could design exactly the life that you wanted? And then sometimes the changes are not that dramatic, and sometimes they are, but often it's more in the subtle things. It's like this process of relaxing into yourself, of letting go, of accepting, of appreciating yourself and then others in turn. And suddenly you have a life you love. Yeah. So
a couple things you said that I completely agree with. First of all, is starting with self-compassion, especially with the people you just described. That's not the easiest thing in the world to do. The other thing that I think is really interesting that you mentioned, and I want to focus on this for a minute, if you will, is around self-acceptance. For the CEOs, the C-suiters, the EVPs, however you want to look at it, the managing directors, how do they gain a level of self-acceptance so for the changes they make, be it seemingly unremarkable or quite substantive, it takes a lot to you have identity loss in that change, identity gain as well, but there's a loss and that can be quite steep. How does someone deal with self-acceptance when they're going through some level of reinvention?
Let me introduce a metaphor that I love to work with in coaching. So I always tell my clients, imagine that when you were born with an inner house. And this inner house has a multitude of different rooms. Some of them are big as ballrooms, others are really small and intimate, little nooks and crannies and staircases, and everything exists. And in every room of this inner house, you can encounter a different way of being human, a different way of experiencing your own humanity, a quality, a characteristic, a way of being. And when you were a child, you ran through this inner house with complete abandon. Right. And if you've ever seen, and I know you have kids, right? They're probably a bit older now, but when they were, let's say maybe 2, they can cycle through this house in incredible speed. And within 2 minutes, they've been in 8 different rooms, right? So they bump their knee and it's this huge drama. And then they see a butterfly and then they're all fascinated, right? Then they see an ice cream truck and they get all greedy. Then you don't want them to buy an ice cream and then they have a huge tantrum. But then they see another child crying and they get full of compassion and want to soothe them, right? Then this other child, she steals their shovel and then they get really angry. So all of that within 2 minutes, you're like, oh my God, what is happening? Right. These juggernauts of experience. Well, one of the reasons why it is so easy as a 2-year-old to run in and out of these rooms is we have no meta narrative about these rooms. They're just states of being. We're angry, we're happy, we're compassionate, we're greedy, we're sad, and then we're not. But then we get domesticated, right? So in come our parents, our grandparents, our schools, nurseries, whatever. So people who educate us about what it means to be a human being. And they begin to teach us, oh no, you don't do that, right? So before long, we begin to observe, not all rooms are equal, because if I step into some of them, I get attention, I get applause, I get rewarded, I get loved. But in other rooms, I get ignored, I get ridiculed, I get punished, or maybe I even get hurt. And so, of course, I'm not stupid, right? So I go, all right, okay, good rooms, bad rooms. I'm not going to go into the bad rooms. Then I begin to lock them off. And I say those are off limits. And to remind myself to not step into any of the bad rooms, I put this big police tape over it that says in bold letters, do not cross.
Right.
But then by the time I'm 25, my house looks like a crime scene, right? Because most of the house was taped off. I just cannot go there anymore. So for me, this process of falling in love with ourselves is actually about becoming an anthropologist in respect to our own inner house and going, what is this room about, right? And then realizing that even, for example, in my homophobic room, there's a gold nugget in there because that room was actually just trying to protect me, right? And that judging can be at the right moment a very, very helpful quality, because it's not wrong to judge. You just need to know when to use it in an appropriate way. For me, that is the biggest part of this work, is helping people to discover and then open these inner rooms so that their life energy, their chi can flow again, instead of just being stuck in 2 or 3 rooms. Like, this is who I am. No, you're not. You're much more than that.
I love that metaphor. And when I think about people who have, air quotations here, reached the top of their profession, they've marched through years, if not decades, in this profession. They've realized that to be successful, there's a level of competence, right? But there's also the extrinsic reward system that will pull us in that direction of where the rewards come from. More bonuses, a bigger title, a promotion and whatever. We conform to that model because we know that that's where the reward is, and that extrinsic reward feels good. The dopamine spikes. Okay, so, but we're not looking in the intrinsic. And so I want to marry that with what you just described, if we can. When you're so accustomed and driven to get that extrinsic hit of that reward, extra bonus that's 50% bigger than last year's, whatever it is. How do we come back to ourselves and say, that's not me? I think there's just something that I want to explore around this notion of acceptance, because I think that's one of the biggest challenges that people have with reinvention is identity loss.
That maybe ties nicely with one of the other areas that I spend quite a bit of time with, and that's our psychological relationship to money, right? And the thing is, we've gotten so obsessed with using money as the one and nearly only measuring stick of the worth we have in the world, of the worth we have as a person, of the success we have created, that instead of becoming a useful tool that we can use to realize visions, something that wants to be in the world, something creative that wants to be expressed, it has actually become our jailer. I very much focus on our individual relationship with money. And by doing that, I draw on the work of my friend and mentor, Peter Koenig, who researched money some 40 years ago, right? And came to be fascinated by the power that money has over us and that money has in organizations and boardrooms, in relationships, right? I mean, to this day, money is still one of the primary reasons for divorce, or at least that's the reason that is being named. Right. And of course, it's always something deeper than money, but everything unfolds around money. So for me, that is one of the exploration points that is really worth looking at, is to help people understand that what they experience money to be is nothing but a projection, because money itself doesn't really have any inherent value. We created money, right? And it can be a very useful means, but not the way we're using it anymore today. I think we've kind of lost the plot with money. But that's basically where I would also start, is to help people realize you're not dealing with a real thing. This unreal thing, by the way, is keeping you captive, and it hasn't produced what you hoped it would produce, because with all the money you have not accomplished happiness. Right. And you have not even accomplished peace of mind, because often, and you will know that from your clients, the more money they have, the more afraid they get they might lose it.
Golden handcuffs are still handcuffs. They can keep us in a place that is not healthy. Is there anything about transformation that needs to be, and I'm talking about personal reinvention, our own transformation, we reach a point in our lives where like, this isn't working for me anymore. Is there something about the transformation that needs to be told more often or reiterated before we go through it, or what's on the other side?
I do think, especially for people who've grown accustomed to be measured from the outside in, to first and foremost look at their relationship to money can be an amazing starting point, because it is so utterly revealing. Yeah, because essentially in what we say in the money work is, what we see in money are fragments of ourselves. So what we reject in money are fragments of what we reject in ourselves. And what we love about money are fragments of ourself that we don't think we have access to unless we have money. So for example, money is freedom. Money doesn't have anything to do with freedom, right? So going back to our previous point that people who have a lot of money often don't feel very free at all, right? No. Another one for me is this notion of, you might not be who you think you are, right? So this notion of a fixed self, of this is who I am, of this somehow stable identity. And what we know now from brain science is all that is a construction that keeps getting reinvented in every moment in time. I'm making stuff up. So whatever I think my memories are of the past, they're not recordings, right? They're not a DVD that I pull out of the closet. They're actually more like paintings, freestyle paintings that I made at some point in my life. And every time I pull them out, I begin to change them again. So that for me is helpful to know, because it also says, well, then I can also in some ways rewrite my past. I don't believe in this linearity of time anymore. There's a wonderful book that the title was, I think, It's Never Too Late to Have Had a Happy Childhood. That comes a bit from this assumption, right? Yet that you can go, in a sense, back in time and even change your memories. Because why wouldn't you? If the narrative that you have right now holds you down and keeps you fixated in a place you don't like, well, then change it. So there's something about the adaptability, if we understand how neuroplasticity works, that our brain is not a fixed construction, right? That cannot be changed anymore, but that it's ever changing until the day we die. I think that opens some very, very hopeful doors.
I don't know if it's a self-protective mechanism or not, that I'm too old to change. You can't teach this old dog new tricks, right? Or you can, actually.
Yeah. It's just such a joyful thing, right? To realize that you can actually change, that you can heal things that you felt are unhealable, that you can forgive people, that you can integrate facets of yourself that you deemed unacceptable. All of that stuff is possible. And it's joyful to see that unfolding.
Absolutely. And it's invigorating as well. I know this from personal experience.
And it gives you new energy, right? Even for crisis
Completely.
moments where you think, oh my God, I cannot continue. But the strength that you get from, I am flexible, like life in me moves in mysterious ways and I'm carried by life in some strange way, is just a wonderful experience.
I could not agree with you more.
My beloved friend and mentor, Peter Koenig, always says, if you want a happy death at some point in your life, you need to have had a fulfilled life, right? So that you can really let go and say, whenever that point comes, this is it. I'm happy. I'm happy to let go. This was an incredible ride. And I believe that. I think that's my strong intention, that when my time has come, I will let go with joy whenever that moment will arrive.
We've covered a lot of ground today, but as we think of something practical that someone could implement, someone who's listening right now who wants to make some changes and could use a tip or a practice, a book to read or something that could help them and they could start today, what would that be?
So I was thinking I would love to take something that I've learned when I was trained myself then as a voice dialogue facilitator, and it relates to this notion of inner selves or inner rooms of your inner house. And it was basically a practice developed for couples, but you can also do it by yourself. But as a couple, it has incredible power because it really shifts the trajectory of a conversation you might have with your partner. So imagine you have something difficult to talk through. Instead of having you sit on one chair, your partner sits on the other chair, and then you start, right? And then you both get trapped in the same old perspectives and it sort of doesn't go anywhere. You could try saying, okay, let's shift chairs, right? So let's say I start with my part of the conversation, but instead of just speaking from this chair, let me see what is a part in me that I can hear that has an opinion about the question or the challenge we're facing. So I might then go to another chair and say, you know what? This part of me is just really pissed off with you. I am so angry, right? So how could you? And then I can let go. Right? And let loose. And I let that part speak, and my partner lets that part speak. Then I come back to my chair, and then I go, but let me see who else might be in there. Then I might go to another chair, and then that part could say, oh my God, when I hear her over there talk, I'm terrified. Like the thought that she would speak to you like that is just terrifying to me because I don't want to lose you. Maybe you take this the wrong way. Maybe you get so hurt that you will end this relationship. Like that would be the worst thing that could happen in my life. I want us to work this out. So a second perspective, right? Then you can go back to your chair. Maybe there's even a third or a fourth. And then you allow your partner to go through the same process. And what happens is that you begin to realize, oh, the person I'm talking to is as complex as I feel within myself. And I might not even have a coherent opinion about something that is going on for me or for us, but neither do they. And then suddenly we can meet from a completely new space of understanding and compassion and openness. And frankly, it's also a lot easier to hear something mean if it is by a part of my partner and not just by my partner. Right? So that is a process that I find incredibly helpful. And if you don't have a partner, another practice of that would move chairs and do some writing about a challenge that you have. And just notice, if you really dig into that particular perspective, what does that part have to say?
From an individual standpoint, just to play this out, because I want to try this myself. So I'm going to sit in a chair and I'm going to write about something that's a perspective that I have.
Well, you would maybe start in, let's say you start where you are right now. You write down what is the question or the challenge I want to explore. And then you notice who in me has an opinion about that. Right? So let's take something simple just to illustrate it. Should I move to another state? Right? That's the question. And then you notice there's a part in me that goes, hell no, right? I mean, we've built community here. We've been here for 20 years. Like, this is the place where everybody knows me, right? I'm losing connection. I'm losing identity. So you just allow that part to really voice what is going on for that part when you think about that question of moving state. Then you come back to your original chair and you go, oh, interesting. So I have this perspective in me, but I am not this perspective. So what else is there? Then suddenly you might hear another voice. So you move chairs again, you go, oh my God, that part thinks moving is exciting, full of new opportunities, right? Being closer to people that I haven't really seen in a long while, because maybe some other people that mean something in my life live there. So then you allow that part to go through this part's understanding and experience of life. You write that down. You come back to your chair. Maybe there's even a third or fourth position, right? And then by the time you've collected all of this data, sometimes for the first time ever, you have not censored any of these voices because you allowed them to run free and just speak their mind until they had nothing else to add. And out of that, it's nearly like you're trying to negotiate in a boardroom or with a team. Suddenly you have all of these diverse perspectives, and now you can gain clarity at a point that is none of these perspectives, but takes into consideration all of them. Does that make sense?
That makes a ton of sense. And the way you described it, is me as the example, was so close to the truth, because we just moved from California to another state on the East Coast. And where we moved from, we were there for 19 years, not 20. But gosh, you were so close with that example. I was like, oh my goodness, you've read my mind.
What you can even do from your sort of starting positions, if you want to get really professional with this, think about some interview questions that you could ask all of these different parts, right? Then you will get, in a way, more consistent data because you let all of them speak about the same questions and go, oh, interesting. So you see this and the other part sees that, but they've answered the same question. So that is another way to go about it.
Is this internal family system work, or is it?
No, it's not, but it is very closely related. So voice dialogue has been around a bit longer than internal family systems. It was founded by Hal and Sidra Stone in the late 60s, I think, and never quite took off in exactly the same way because they've not been as rigorous about their curriculum. They never believed in certifications and all of that. But I really feel they're sort of the grandmothers of this kind of work. And I really deeply love and appreciate their wisdom.
Absolutely amazing. Voice dialogue work. I think this is a really interesting tool for people to explore.
I tell you what, AJ, I will give you the chapter of my book that deals with this modality, and we can create a download link for people. If you want to link that, then people can just download that chapter.
I love it. Thank you so much. Let's do that. And then how can people find you, Nadja?
So I'm on LinkedIn, but then you have to type in this very complicated full name, Nadjeschda Taranczewski. My company's webpage is ConsciousU.com. And then I recently launched an online coaching community for women called ConsciousSistersSociety.com. And that is, as I said, for women, but maybe the the odd partner of one of your listeners could be interested in that. Yeah, so that's where I can be found.
And we will have all those in the show notes. Wow. Nadja, what a fascinating conversation, covering so much ground, some of your personal journey, the journey of your ancestors during a very difficult time in our world, in our history, exploring some really cool stuff. This voice dialogue, I'm so excited. And thank you for offering your chapter from your book. I just think that there's just to introduce new ways to break through is so important, is absolutely so critical. And start with people who listen to me or know my message. Starting with self-compassion is so important. And I'm so glad that Nadja talked about that right at the top of our discussion. Love yourself as if you'd love a friend, and give yourself that space and love. And then self-acceptance is its cousin. And I think having that self-acceptance is vital and maybe hard to get to, but just cannot be overlooked at all. And that's so important. If this resonated with you, listeners, please check out my company website. So my company is More, and our website is bemorealigned.com. And we're building a destination for accomplished, successful professionals and who are sort of coming to the conclusion that the life they built, something's off and it doesn't fit, but they know there's more out there for them. And so we exist to help people who want to move from autopilot to more aliveness and want to get really radically honest about what they want and do something about it. I would love to hear from you always about the show, about possible guests, about feedback on anything, about any professional inquiries. I can be reached at hello@bemorealigned.com. And remember that life doesn't wait for the perfect moment. It waits for the moment you decide to stop settling. And when your life feels like when your status quo feels like status no, it's time to act. Again, I'm AJ Jones. Until next time, stay honest, aligned, and don't wait for that wake-up call.